In February 1938, a fire inspector named Gerald Wickham was called to examine the remains of a collapsed farmhouse near the border of southern Kentucky and Tennessee, a structure that had burned so hot the limestone foundation itself had cracked. What he found in the ashes would haunt him for the rest of his life. Wedding photographs melted into the floorboards, and beneath them, in a root cellar that had somehow survived the flames, a leather-bound family Bible with marriage records that made his hands shake as he turned the pages. The same names appeared again and again: fathers marrying daughters, uncles wedding nieces, brothers sharing wives. But it was the final entry, written in a child's unsteady hand, that made Wickham seal the Bible in an evidence box and mark it, "Do not open without authorization." It read, "Today I became Mama's sister and Papa's wife. I am 11 years old." God forgive us all. Before we descend into this story, subscribe and leave a comment telling us which state you're from. These hidden American tragedies need witnesses, and your voice keeps them from being forgotten. Gerald Wickham had been a fire inspector for nearly 2 decades, and he'd seen his share of tragedy. Barn fires that claimed livestock, house fires that took entire families, industrial accidents that left nothing but twisted metal. But the Hollenbeck farmhouse was different. The locals in Harlan County, Kentucky, had been reluctant to even report the fire. When Wickham arrived 3 days after the blaze, he found the road to the property overgrown, as if no one had driven it in years. The nearest neighbors, a family called the Pruitts, claimed they hadn't seen smoke, hadn't heard anything, didn't know the Hollenbecks well, even though they'd lived a quarter-mile apart for generations. The house itself had been reduced to a blackened skeleton. The roof had caved in completely, and the walls, what was left of them, leaned inward like the ribs of some great dead beast. Wickham walked the perimeter first, noting the unusual construction. The windows were too small, barely large enough for a child to squeeze through. The door frames were reinforced with iron bars on the inside, as if designed to keep people in rather than intruders out. And everywhere, melted into the scorched wood, were photographs, dozens of them, hundreds perhaps, all depicting the same stern faces, the same hollow eyes, the same cruel set of the jaw passed down through what must have been 4 or 5 generations. It was in the root cellar, accessible only through a collapsed section of flooring, that Wickham found the Bible. The cellar had been dug deep, nearly 12 feet down, and lined with smooth river stones. The air inside was thick and cold, even in February, and carried a smell that Wickham would later describe as sweet rot, like a mass grave covered in honeysuckle. The Bible sat on a wooden shelf, alongside jars of preserved vegetables that had somehow survived the heat, and a series of leather-bound journals that fell apart when he tried to open them. Their pages fused together by moisture and time, but the Bible was intact. Wickham sat on the cellar floor and read by flashlight, and with each page, he felt his understanding of the world shift slightly, like a house settling on a weak foundation. The Hollenbeck family tree wasn't a tree at all. It was a knot, a tangle, a closed loop that fed back into itself again and again. The first entry was dated 1847. Josiah Hollenbeck wed to Sarah Hollenbeck, his sister, in the eyes of God if not the law. From there the pattern repeated with mechanical precision. Sons married mothers after the father died. Daughters were wed to grandfathers. First cousins were the loosest relationship recorded. And they were rare. Most unions were far closer, far darker. The handwriting changed over the decades, but the script remained eerily similar, as if the same hand had written every entry across 90 years. Wickham later theorized that each generation taught the next to write in an identical style, maintaining continuity, erasing individuality. The names repeated: Josiah, Sarah, Malachi, Ruth, Obadiah. Every 3rd or 4th generation, the same names cycled back, and with them came notations in the margins: stillborn, malformed, lived 3 days, buried in the north field, eyes wrong, too many fingers, tongue split, born without sound. But it was the final entry that stopped Wickham cold. The handwriting was shaky, clearly written by someone young or injured or both. The date was February 14th, 1938, 3 days before the fire. And the words were a confession, an epitaph, and a curse all at once. Wickham couldn't let it go. He brought the Bible to his supervisor, who promptly locked it in a filing cabinet and told him to forget what he'd seen. But Wickham had copied the names, the dates, the patterns. He began digging through county records, census data, church registries. What he found, or rather what he didn't find, was almost as disturbing as the Bible itself. The Hollenbeck family appeared in the 1850 census, but only as a single entry. Josiah Hollenbeck, farmer, age 34, 6 dependents. No names for the dependents. No ages, no relationships. The same pattern held in 1860, 1870, 1880. By 1890, the census taker had added a note in the margin: family refuses interview. Observed from road. 7 individuals visible, conditions poor. The 1900 census listed them as unavailable, and by 1910 the family didn't appear at all, as if they'd been erased from official record entirely. But Wickham found something else, a notation in a state health inspector's report from 1889. Dr. Clement Ashford, a physician sent by the Kentucky Board of Health to investigate reports of illness in the remote hill country, had visited the Hollenbeck property. His report was clinical, detached, but the horror bled through the formal language. Visited the Hollenbeck homestead on October 3, 1889, found 12 individuals living in conditions of extreme deprivation. The patriarch, who identified himself only as father, refused to provide names or ages for the others. Observed multiple cases of severe physical deformity, microcephaly, polydactyly, cleft palate, and what appeared to be hereditary neuropathy. Several children exhibited signs of rickets and scurvy. One adult female, approximately 20-25 years of age, claimed to be both daughter and wife to the patriarch. When questioned, she became agitated and insisted she had been chosen by God for this purpose. The family speaks in a dialect nearly incomprehensible, mixing archaic English with what may be invented religious terminology. Recommend immediate intervention, though I fear the isolation and ideological commitment of this group will resist any official action. No intervention came. Ashford's report was filed and forgotten, but Wickham found a follow-up notation, dated 1891, written by a different inspector. Attempted to visit Hollenbeck property. Turned back at property line by armed family members. County sheriff declines to intervene, citing lack of specific criminal complaint. Recommend case be closed. So the family had continued, undisturbed, for another 47 years. Wickham began to piece together the timeline. The patriarch in 1889 would have been a descendant of the original Josiah and Sarah, perhaps a grandson or great-grandson. That meant the tradition had already been in place for at least 2 generations by the time Dr. Ashford visited. And it continued unbroken until the fire in 1938. But who had set the fire? And why had the final entry in the Bible been written by a child? Wickham tracked down the county coroner, who'd handled the remains from the fire. Dr. Eugene Phelps was in his 70s by then, semi-retired, living in a cabin outside of Pineville. He remembered the case immediately. "Worst thing I ever saw," he told Wickham over black coffee in his cramped kitchen. "And I saw plenty in the war." Phelps had recovered 5 bodies from the wreckage, though he suspected there had been more. The fire had burned so hot that bone fragments were scattered and incomplete. Of the 5 he examined, 3 were children. 1 was a woman in her early 20s, and 1 was an elderly man. The man's body had been found near the cellar entrance, as if he'd been trying to descend into it when he died. The woman and children had been in what remained of the upstairs, but it was the details in Phelps's autopsy notes that revealed the full scope of the horror. The elderly man, presumed to be the family patriarch, showed signs of advanced syphilis, untreated and likely hereditary. His bones were riddled with lesions consistent with tertiary stage infection. The woman's skeleton told a different story. She'd given birth at least 4 times, possibly more, and showed evidence of healed fractures in her ribs, wrists, and jaw. Defensive wounds, Phelps noted. Signs of prolonged abuse. The children were worse. 2 of them had skulls that were visibly misshapen, one with a pronounced cranial ridge, suggesting premature fusion of the sutures, the other with a bulging forehead and recessed jaw. The 3rd child, a girl approximately 10 years old, had a spinal curvature so severe that Phelps estimated she would have been unable to walk upright. But the most disturbing finding came from tissue samples Phelps had preserved in formaldehyde. In 1938, genetic testing didn't exist, but Phelps had noticed something odd. The blood types of the 5 victims were nearly identical, and all showed markers consistent with extreme consanguinity, closer than first cousins, closer even than siblings. In his notes, Phelps wrote, "This family's blood is so intermingled that I cannot establish normal familial relationships. The woman may have been daughter, sister, and niece to the patriarch simultaneously. The children exhibit genetic abnormalities consistent with multi-generational inbreeding. I hesitate to include my full findings in the official report, as I fear they will be dismissed as impossible." He was right to hesitate. When Phelps submitted his autopsy report to the county, it was returned with a note from the county attorney. "Revise conclusions. Findings too extreme for public record. List cause of death as fire-related trauma and close case." Phelps complied. The official death certificates listed smoke inhalation and thermal injury. The genetic nightmare, the evidence of abuse, the implications of the Bible's marriage records, all of it was buried. The county wanted the Hollenbeck family to disappear quietly, without questions, without scandal. And for nearly 8 decades, that's exactly what happened. But Gerald Wickham kept digging. In 1942, 4 years after the fire, he received an anonymous package at his home. Inside was a stack of photographs, the same images he'd seen melted into the floorboards of the Hollenbeck house, but these were pristine, carefully preserved in archival sleeves. There was no return address, no note, no explanation, just the photographs. Wickham spread them across his dining room table and studied them for hours. Most were formal portraits, taken in what appeared to be the Hollenbeck farmhouse itself. The same small windows, the same reinforced doors visible in the background. The subject stared directly at the camera with expressions of blank defiance, as if daring the viewer to judge them. One photograph showed a wedding. The bride wore a white dress that was too large for her, hanging off her narrow shoulders like a burial shroud. She looked no older than 12. The groom stood beside her, one hand gripping her shoulder, the other holding a Bible. He was at least 60, his face deeply lined, his eyes sunken but fierce. Behind them, arranged in 2 rows, were what Wickham assumed were family members, but their resemblance to each other was so pronounced that they looked less like a family and more like a single person photographed multiple times. Same eyes, same jaw, same expression of hollow submission. Another photograph showed a group of children, ranging in age from toddler to adolescent. They were arranged by height, standing in front of the farmhouse. Every single one had the same vacant stare, the same too wide mouth, the same oddly proportioned limbs. One child, a boy of perhaps 8, had 6 fingers on his left hand. Another, a girl, had eyes that didn't align properly, one pointing slightly inward. In the background, barely visible in the shadow of the doorway, was an adult figure, watching, always watching. But it was the final photograph that shattered Wickham's composure. It showed a young girl, perhaps 10 or 11, sitting in a wooden chair. She wore a white nightgown, and her hair had been braided with flowers. In her lap was a baby swaddled tightly. The girl's eyes were red from crying, and her expression was one of absolute despair. Written on the back of the photograph, in the same childish handwriting from the final Bible entry, were 3 words: "This is me." Wickham tried to trace the origin of the package, but the postmark was smudged, unreadable. He contacted the post office, the local police, even the FBI. No one could or would help him. The photographs were added to his private collection of evidence, locked in a trunk in his attic. He would spend the rest of his life trying to understand what he'd uncovered, but the answers always slipped away, hidden behind layers of silence and complicity. In the decades that followed, the story of the Hollenbeck family became a ghost story, a legend, a cautionary tale whispered around fires in the Kentucky hill country. Locals claimed the land where the farmhouse had stood was cursed, that crops wouldn't grow there, that animals refused to cross it, that people who ventured too close reported hearing children's voices singing hymns in a language that didn't quite sound like English. In 1965, a developer tried to buy the property. He planned to clear the land and build vacation cabins. Within a week of breaking ground, 2 of his workers quit, claiming they'd seen figures moving through the trees at night, pale, thin figures that watched but never spoke. A 3rd worker was injured when a tree fell on him during clear weather, crushing his legs. The developer abandoned the project. The land returned to wilderness. In 1978, a group of college students from the University of Kentucky drove out to the site as part of an anthropology project. They wanted to document the ruins, to photograph what remained, to interview locals about the family's history. They found the foundation, cracked and overgrown, and the entrance to the root cellar now collapsed and filled with debris. One of the students, a young woman named Margaret Doyle, descended into the cellar with a flashlight. She was down there for less than 5 minutes before scrambling back up, pale and shaking. She refused to speak about what she'd seen, but her friends reported that she kept repeating the same phrase. "They're still down there. They're still waiting." Margaret left the university the following semester and was never heard from again. In 1989, a historian named Dr. Raymond Kovach published a book titled Forgotten Communities of Appalachia, which included a brief chapter on the Hollenbeck family. He'd obtained copies of the census records, the health inspector's reports, and Dr. Phelps's original autopsy notes, the uncensored version that had never been officially filed. His conclusion was clinical but damning. The Hollenbeck family represented one of the most extreme cases of intergenerational incest in American history, sustained across nearly a century through religious fanaticism, geographic isolation, and community indifference. The book sold poorly and was remaindered within a year. Dr. Kovach received death threats from people in Harlan County who claimed he was slandering their heritage, exploiting tragedy for profit, disturbing the dead. He never wrote about the Hollenbecks again. In 2003, a woman named Evelyn Marsh contacted the Kentucky Historical Society with a startling claim. She was, she said, a descendant of the Hollenbeck family, the daughter of a girl who had escaped the farmhouse in 1937, 1 year before the fire. Evelyn was in her late 60s, living in Ohio under a different name, and she'd kept her mother's secret for her entire life. But her mother had recently passed away, and Evelyn felt compelled to share the truth, to give testimony to break the silence. Her mother's name had been Ada Hollenbeck. She'd been born in 1926, the daughter of Malachi Hollenbeck and Ruth Hollenbeck, who were, according to the family Bible, father and daughter, making Ada the product of incest. Ada had grown up in the farmhouse, isolated from the outside world, taught to read only the Bible, to speak only when spoken to obey father without question. When Ada was 11, father had informed her that she would become his wife. The ceremony would take place on her 12th birthday. This was God's will, he told her. This was their family's sacred duty, to keep the bloodline pure, to preserve the chosen lineage, to resist the corruption of the outside world. But Ada had been different. She'd found a cache of books hidden in the cellar, old novels, almanacs, newspapers from decades past, left behind by an ancestor who'd once traveled beyond the hills. She'd taught herself to read beyond the Bible, to imagine a world outside the farmhouse, to question what father told her. 3 days before her 12th birthday, Ada ran. She waited until father was asleep, slipped out through a cellar window that had been left unbarred, and ran through the woods until her feet bled. She was found the next morning by a traveling minister, who took her to a church in the next county. The minister's wife fed her, clothed her, and asked no questions, perhaps because she understood that some truths were too terrible to speak aloud. Ada never returned. She changed her name, moved north, married a factory worker, and tried to forget, but the nightmares never stopped. She'd wake screaming about the cellar, about the photographs, about the children who were born wrong, about father's hands on her shoulders and his voice whispering that she was chosen, blessed, loved. And she told Evelyn one more thing, a detail that Evelyn had carried for decades, unsure whether to believe it. Ada claimed that she wasn't the only one who'd tried to escape. There had been others, an older sister, a cousin, a boy who'd been born with both male and female anatomy, and was therefore considered an abomination by father. All of them had tried to run. None of them made it off the property. Ada believed they were buried in the North Field, the one mentioned in the Bible's margin notes. She'd seen father digging there at night, had heard him praying over fresh-turned earth, had watched as he burned the clothes and belongings of those who'd failed to submit. The fire, Ada believed, had been set by one of the remaining children, a final act of rebellion, a merciful end to a cursed lineage. She didn't know who, but she suspected it was the youngest girl, the one father had already marked as his next bride. the same girl who'd written the final Bible entry. Evelyn's testimony prompted a new investigation. In 2004, a team of forensic anthropologists, backed by a state grant and armed with ground-penetrating radar, surveyed the Hollenbeck property. They focused on the North Field, the area Ada had described. The radar detected 37 anomalies consistent with human burial. 37. Excavation began in the spring of 2005. The team worked slowly, carefully, documenting every find. Most of the remains were too degraded for detailed analysis, but they recovered enough to confirm Evelyn's story. Skeletal remains ranging from infants to young adults, buried in shallow graves without coffins or markers. Many showed signs of trauma: fractured skulls, broken limbs, evidence of violence. Several of the children's skeletons displayed genetic abnormalities: fused vertebrae, extra ribs, malformed pelvises. DNA analysis confirmed what everyone already suspected. All of the remains belonged to individuals with extreme genetic similarity, consistent with multi-generational incest. The forensic anthropologists estimated that the burials spanned from the 1860s to the 1930s, a 70-year period during which the Hollenbeck family had systematically eliminated anyone who threatened their isolated existence. The findings were published in a forensic journal in 2007. The article was cited in discussions of genetic disorders, of historical abuse, of the failures of rural oversight, but the story never reached mainstream attention. It remained an academic footnote, a case study, a curiosity. The land was eventually donated to the state as a protected historical site, though no marker was ever placed. The graves were reinterred, blessed by a local minister and covered with wildflowers. The ruins of the farmhouse were bulldozed and buried, and still, locals refused to go there after dark. The Hollenbeck bloodline ended in fire and shallow graves, but the questions it raises remain alive, festering in the dark corners of American history. How many other families existed like this, hidden in the mountains, the swamps, the deserts, sustained by faith, fear, and the indifference of neighbors who saw smoke rising but chose not to investigate? How many children were buried in unnamed fields, their lives erased before they'd barely begun, their suffering dismissed as the price of isolation? Ada Hollenbeck lived to be 81 years old. She died in a nursing home in Cleveland, surrounded by children and grandchildren who never knew her original name. But Evelyn said her mother spoke in her final hours, slipping back into the dialect of the farmhouse, murmuring names that had been dead for 70 years, begging forgiveness from people who had never existed outside that closed, cursed loop. The farmhouse is gone now, reclaimed by kudzu and bramble. The cellar has collapsed completely. The photographs are locked in an archive that few people know exists. But in Harlan County, in the hollers where smoke still curls from wood stoves and old families still keep to themselves, people remember. They don't speak the name Hollenbeck aloud, but they know it. They know what it means. And on certain nights, when the wind carries the scent of wildflowers and rot, they say you can still hear singing from the North Field. Children's voices, thin and high, singing hymns in a language that sounds almost like English but isn't quite, singing prayers that were never meant for human ears, echoing from a bloodline that should have ended 100 years ago, but somehow, impossibly, still whispers in the dark. Some bloodlines don't die, they just wait.